Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone here today. Thanks for joining today's TED Talk as we're covering a very interesting topic in headless content management systems. My name is Lee Ribeiro. I'm a product marketing manager for Oracle Content and Experience. I have a really special guest joining me today, and you guys are in for a treat. Preston So, Senior Director, Product Strategy here for Oracle and Content and Experience. Is going to help lead the conversation here around headless content management systems and really their role in creating digital experiences. I say you guys are in for a treat because Preston here has over decades worth of experience, not only working in and around headless content management systems, but also speaking at major conferences and events across the world on it. So you kind of say he's somewhat of a globally recognized subject matter expert on the topic. So pretty excited to get this going. You want to hop into the agenda here?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lee, for that very kind introduction. Yes, welcome everyone to Headless CMS, Creating Modern Digital Experiences. I want to thank both Lee and Marcy for facilitating this conversation today. Obviously, a lot of us have a very clear sense of what a traditional content management system is, but what exactly is this new thing known as a headless CMS or a decoupled CMS? I want to talk about not only why this is important for your developer teams and your technical teams, but also why this is extremely important as a concept for your marketing and editorial teams as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with the agenda here. First and foremost, did want to share our normal standard safe harbor statement. This is not commitment, obviously, but just a summary and the vision of what we want to be doing. Today is actually primarily going to be not a coverage of a product roadmap, but more about the general landscape of headless CMS, why it is that you would want to consider a headless CMS, and why Oracle CX Content in particular is the best choice that you have available on the market today for a headless CMS. We'll start off with a little bit of an introduction to the whole idea of a headless or decoupled CMS, what's involved in these kinds of architectures, why they're becoming so popular among developers, and why a lot of the other teams in the content process world, people who are marketers, people who are content editors, are a little bit more reticent about this runaway adoption of headless or decoupled CMSs. I'll mention briefly one of the driving motivations for the headless CMS, which is the digital channel explosion, which we'll delve into very briefly. And I want to talk about some of the underlying motivations and rationales for why it is that we want to use a headless or decoupled CMS, not only from the perspective of a developer, not only from the perspective of a content editor, but from the perspective of your customers and how you forge a customer experience that is very, very tightly attuned to and very, very focused on where those users are consuming their content. Next, I want to share a little bit about some of the capabilities, and Lee will join me back on stage with some information about some of the really exciting features that we've got in CX Content and some of the very interesting roadmap features that are now coming up. And I'll talk a little bit about our developer ecosystem and why it is that you want to use Oracle CX Content as your headless CMS and as your API-first foundational layer for all of your content delivery in the omnichannel. And then finally, I want to finish with just a couple of notes about how Oracle CX Content enables better approaches to JavaScript and Jamstack development, deployment and development, both things that you might have heard recently, and things that are very, very different from the normal way that we deploy typical websites or web applications. So let's start first and foremost with a little bit of information about what exactly is a headless or decoupled CMS. And many of you might have already heard of some of the major players in the headless CMS market, folks that go by the name of Contentful or Prismic, but you might not have heard Oracle's name come up very much in those conversations. Believe it or not, Oracle has a very, very impressive decoupled content management system that not only matches up to, but in certain aspects, in certain areas, exceeds and outperforms the headless CMSs that are currently available today in the larger industry. But first, let's define what exactly a headless CMS or a decoupled CMS is in the first place. Simply put, at its very core, a headless or decoupled CMS is really a content management system that is not included with the presentation layer. So either there is an exclusion of the presentation layer or there is a presentation layer, a front-end layer, that isn't actually part and parcel of the customer experience. What this means is that a traditional content management system or any content management system used in this headless or decoupled way is primarily concerned about how to transmit and deliver the data that is trapped within that content management system and how to expose that out through APIs, application programming interfaces, for external consumers. And these consumers can be other third-party services. They can be Oracle services like Eloqua, Responses, but they can also be typical digital experiences and applications and devices that today are increasingly characterizing our digital experience day to day. Meaning our mobile applications, our native desktop applications, our smartwatches, our smart TVs, all of these are potential destinations and important conduits through which content delivery occurs in the headless CMS environment. For those of you who are a little bit more visual, I'm a very visual person, here's a little bit of a schematic that shows what we're talking about here. Generally speaking, in a monolithic or a traditional CMS architecture, a traditional content management architecture, what you have is an inextricable front end from the back end, which means that if you're using Oracle CX Content as your visual site builder, as your template manager, as your layout manager, as your site builder, one of the things that you'll notice is that it's not possible to separate out your site builder or your visual building capabilities within your CX Content instance into a totally distinct front end that might be written in a different technology. You have to use CX Content's built-in front end to be able to drive the site builder and drive all of the visual building techniques that Oracle CX Content contains today. In the headless or in the decoupled context, however, it's a very different scenario. Rather than having a front end or a presentation layer that cannot be separated or taken out of the CMS, instead, what you have is the front end or the presentation layer is superseded by a separate consumer that could be written in a different language, that could still be written in Java, but that might be written in other languages or approaches that you might have heard of, like JavaScript, or mobile languages like Swift or Objective-C or Kotlin. Now, all of these applications and all of these digital experiences need to pull data from somewhere. And that's where our REST API comes into play. The REST API is one of the most important facets of a headless CMS architecture in that it mediates the delivery of data from the CMS itself and the data structures within the CMS out to a format that is understandable for other consumers to use. Generally speaking, today, most REST APIs will serve out JSON or JavaScript object notation. And there's also an emerging feature, an emerging query language known as GraphQL, which you might have heard of. Very, very common in the React ecosystem. And this GraphQL API is something that we're also introducing into our Oracle CX Content developer experience to enable much richer interactions with this underlying data. Now, one of the things that might be a little bit hard to see from this diagram here is the fact that a single CX Content instance, a single CX Content backend, can actually serve a variety of different front ends. So you can use a single Oracle CX Content database and backend to drive delivery of content to all of the digital experiences that you can think of and that you manage without having to create a whole new CMS or having to create a whole new kind of underlying data layer as a foundation. What this also means is that you can not only serve Oracle CX Content data out to all of these different consumers that are written in different technologies, but you can multi-leverage Oracle CX Content as both a monolithic CMS, meaning that you can use it simultaneously as your inextricable front end with the visual builder and your site builder, at the same time that you serve out to other consumers that might not be able to be manipulated in the same way. There's a lot of industry experts and a lot of folks in the market who call this model hybrid headless. I don't like the name, but it's a name that we've seen come up quite a bit. And that is merely the idea of using a CMS not only in its traditional sense as a site builder and as a visual builder, but also as a decoupled backend, as a decoupled server that can be used to deliver data to a variety of different consumers. So let's talk briefly about one of the reasons why this is taking place. There's, I would say, two separate forces that are really driving the adoption of headless CMS. And one is very important to those of us who are on marketing teams, those of us who are very concerned about customer experience. And the other is more focused on those who are building and implementing these kinds of digital experiences and who are more on the developer profile side of things. Unfortunately, one of the things that's happening is that both the marketing forces and the developer forces are driving the adoption of headless CMSs, and is one of the reasons why you should really consider Oracle CS Content as your next ideal, optimal headless CMS. Over the past 10 years, we've seen an explosion in the kinds of digital experiences that we need to serve. And one of the things that everyone on this webinar may have heard about is that Gartner, for example, earlier this year announced the retirement of the Web Content Management System Magic Quadrant in favor of a name that is a little bit less really clear, which is a digital experience platform. But in the subtext of this shift that Gartner has made is the fact that we're no longer thinking of the website or web-based experiences as the primary means by which customers can interact with our content, especially with regards to a CMS. Nowadays, we're talking about digital transformation in the context of a much larger array of marketing experiences and customer experiences that need to be made available for B2B and B2C implementations. And one of the things that we also know is that 10 years ago, which might have been the last time that you thought about adopting a new or looking at a new headless CMS, or sorry, a new CMS vendor in general, the website was the primary consumer of content from a CMS. But of course, one of the things that we're facing, and especially today with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, is the fact that our users and our customers are now interacting with this content, interacting with their data in a much more multifaceted way than they were in the past. It's not just solely a matter of using a web browser to access content on a website. We're now talking about folks who use mobile applications to access their content, people who use smartwatches to access content, and also more innovative and more revolutionary or experimental experiences like mixed reality interfaces, augmented reality, virtual reality, or even conversational interfaces like voice interfaces and voice assistants. These are all important conduits by which customers are now getting their content. And if you're only thinking about your content from the context of a CMS-driven website, you're already a little bit behind, because a lot of the primary drivers of innovation in the CMS market have been really focused on how to enable not just website building, but also the building of all of these other experiences that are today important facets of our digital experiences. We're talking about iPhones and Android applications today as well, in addition to the web-based mobile apps that you might have written in the past with Cordova or Xamarin. And these are very, very much important to the ways in which our customers retrieve and acquire data and content. One of the things that's been coming up over the past 4 to 5 years is the proliferation of smart TVs, of set-top boxes. One of the things that's really come up in the last few years is the need to serve content out to some of these televisions. Oftentimes when you have an interface like Netflix or an interface like Hulu, all of that content about the programs and all of the content that's related to the metadata around runtime, or all of the data wrapped up in descriptions and major people who were involved in this production. Those are all important things to account for in a CMS, but that can only be delivered to a television such as a Roku application or a Samsung TV application in the context of a headless CMS. You can't use a site builder or a web-based CMS to serve content to a television. At the same time, we're also facing the proliferation of what I call micro content, which is increasingly this notion of content that is not in long form, that is not in the form of prose, but is actually in the form of one-sentence tidbits or microcosmic forms of content that we increasingly find on a day-to-day basis. Technologist Neil Dash, about 10 years ago, had a blog post that defined micro-content as the kinds of content that we write all the time on a daily basis, every single time we send a text message or write a social media post, but that don't fit into the normal CMS conception of content. But this kind of micro-content is very important to prioritize at the same level as the macro-content that we might write as a website article or as a CMS content item. Increasingly today, we also find content being placed on digital signage and being placed on information kiosks. And increasingly today, with the advent of more alerts and information and breaking news alerts that we find in public environments due to the pandemic, digital signage is very important. And this is another reason why a lot of folks are moving towards the headless CMS model. How do you craft a digital sign or an information kiosk experience within a CMS that's primarily designed for building websites? If your developers need a rich array of functionality to drive digital signs and information kiosks, that's something that a headless CMS can do for you, and that CX Content also provides for you as well through our APIs. Museums and customer experiences that are now moving into a more virtual setting or social distancing also need to deal with the notion of the fact that a lot of folks and a lot of visitors to these museums cannot come in person. This means that we have to provide all of the same content that a museum would provide through its website in the context of a digital experience, such as a virtual reality interface in the context of museums that cannot serve their collections in person, or in the case of augmented reality, where potentially you might be able to magnify an artwork or an artifact that you want to take a closer look at. How do you get this content to be served in an augmented reality interface without something like a headless CMS like CX Content? And finally, of course, voice interfaces and conversational interfaces. If you're using, for example, Oracle Digital Assistant, our own chatbot interface, or if you're building a chatbot yourself or using Dialogflow to build a voice interface, how do you serve content from a CMS that is built and purpose-built for that purpose, and that is really going to enable your developers to be able to build conversational interfaces according to the frameworks that they're using? And these are all very important considerations for marketing teams as well. How will you serve all of this content that's currently sequestered away in your website in a format that's going to make sense, and in a format that's going to be previewable and approvable by your customers and by your users of that CMS as well? And as I mentioned earlier, headless CMS architectures are also important because they serve as that integration layer with other services and platforms. If you're working with Oracle Commerce Cloud, for example, or if you're building something using any of our marketing tools like Eloqua, Responses, or if you're working with personalization tools such as our internal recommendations feature within Oracle CX Content, you need to be able to serve all of those kinds of features out to the variety of digital experiences and a diverse range of experiences that your customers are increasingly approaching you on. It's no longer enough to just use something like Optimizely or to just use content mills like Outbrain to serve a website. You need to be able to have all of those sorts of things be targeted towards your users and personalized and focused on that user experience on each of the devices that you're talking about, and not just the website itself. Of course, one of the problems with headless CMS is something that I want to be honest with you about. And I believe in integrity and transparency when it comes to communicating both pros and cons. I shared with you some of the advantages and some of the reasons why folks are adopting headless CMSs. Unfortunately, there's also a drawback to headless CMSs, and one that oftentimes marketing teams and editorial teams aren't able to consider with quite the level of depth that developers are, solely because of the fact that headless CMSs are really deep into the developer experience focus. And that is that there is a slight incongruity when it comes to headless CMSs, and that is that when it comes to a marketer or an editorial experience, you're primarily going to be using the visual builder and leveraging things like the website builder or the responsive layout templates that we have available to build an experience that works for all of these users on any device as they're approaching a website. But when it comes to all of these other experiences, there's actually a bit of a problem in that primarily these wearable experiences, digital signage, virtual reality, augmented reality, smart TVs, voice interfaces, are really focused on developer-built experiences. There's not really a site builder that's good for mobile applications, apart from our, of course, mobile hub capabilities. There's not really a very graceful way to build digital signage in an in-place way or an in-context way, in a way that's going to really focus on an audience that cannot write code to produce these experiences. One of the good things I can tell you, and one of the good pieces of news I have for you, is that this is a problem that Oracle CX Content is working very, very hard on. And our goal is to massively expand this marketer experience box so that not only can developers have the insight and the ability to approve and preview and drive the management of these experiences, but also the users that are primarily involved in things like editorial considerations, embargoed content, compliance, DAM systems. All of the users who are left behind by these developer-built experiences will have much more involvement in the ways that these workflows work. So if you're curious about some of these approaches that we're building into Oracle CX content, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and we'll also have more information coming up in our roadmap in the future as well. I wrote a blog post about this very problem, by the way, and how a lot of the CMS vendors today, including Oracle, need to think about this problem on my blog, preston.so. If you're curious, you can check out the articles there, as well as an article I recently wrote on CMS Wire about this very issue. So why is it that people want to adopt a headless or decoupled CMS in the first place? Primarily, the technical teams are adopting headless CMSs because of the fact that the total cost of ownership is increasing in a very substantial way among enterprise CMS users. One of the problems that we found with these normal CMS builds is that they are becoming more and more expensive. And oftentimes, a lot of these headless CMSs can provide a much more reasonable and affordable approach that is very much catered to the amount of usage that you'll see from a typical headless CMS architecture as opposed to a monolithic CMS architecture. CX Content recently revamped our pricing tiers and our pricing structure to focus more on utility. And that sort of pricing is going to be very much important to how you are able to budget and look at your cost calculations in terms of infrastructure. Next up also is that a lot of cloud solutions are increasingly unaffordable, and a lot of developers have turned to companies like Netlify and Zeit to really host more of these experiences that are much more affordable in the form of hosting in a format that's a lot more amenable to the lower cost solutions that these platforms provide. And there is a lot to be said about using a very robust and mature and rich solution like Oracle CX Content, and also using Oracle's built-in infrastructure to drive your Node.js or your JavaScript implementations. But there is also a lot to be said about using other serverless hosting providers as well. By using CX Content as a headless CMS, you unlock the door to a lot of this flexibility in terms of vendor selection and picking and choosing your vendors. And you can choose more flexibly the kinds of solutions that you want for yourself with this headless CMS architecture built in. A lot of CMS builds that have happened over the last several years, and often a lot of commerce builds as well, have been facing a lot of issues in terms of high cost, in terms of antiquated pricing models that are really based on website-driven metrics as opposed to API-driven metrics that are really important to the vast array of digital experiences that we now have today. And for those of you who are looking at static site generators or serverless hosting providers as well, there's a lot of really compelling hosting providers out there that will be great to do intermixture with in terms of the amazing capabilities that Oracle CX Content provides for you today. And we have many examples of customers and partners today that are leveraging not only the greatness of Oracle Cloud Infrastructure and the greatness of Oracle CX Content, along with its rich integrations with Eloqua and responses, in conjunction with some of these serverless infrastructure providers, or also our built-in Node.js hosting within Oracle's Cloud Infrastructure. One of the other issues that I think many of us are facing today is that CMS developers and those who are very specialized in these ecosystems are in very high demand, and they command a very high price. But today, the most common language that is used in building digital experiences is JavaScript. And you'll find that as you look for developers to join your technical teams, it's much harder to find developers who specialize in these very limited ecosystems and these very microcosmic ecosystems, as opposed to JavaScript in general, which is a much, much larger ecosystem of developers to draw from. Also, the specialization in CMSs is a very big problem. One of the biggest issues that we hear all the time from folks who are using Adobe or Sitecore is the fact that because of those closed ecosystems, you no longer have the ability to work with developers who might be specialists or generalists in a variety of different areas. You need to use somebody who's an Adobe expert or a Sitecore expert. And up until recently, you had to do that with Oracle as well. You had to use an Oracle expert who was very well versed in the internals and the ways in which the Oracle's kind of internal technology works. But today, if you want to hire a JavaScript team, you can use Oracle CX Content as a headless CMS, and you can drive a variety of different builds with a variety of different developer profiles that go well beyond the more closed Oracle ecosystem that you might have today. Which means that you can hire developers much more openly and much more flexibly than you were able to before. I want to stop here because this is one of the most important considerations for developers today. And this is the primary reason why headless CMSs are being adopted in droves by developers. And that is that people are increasingly looking for more modern developer experiences that reflect the kinds of applications and developer experiences that they want to work with. There's been over the past, I would say, 6 to 7 years, what I call and what many people call the JavaScript Renaissance, which is really a shift in the amount of innovation that's been happening in JavaScript. It started back in 2013 with the advent of Node.js, which was the very first time that server-side JavaScript was possible, meaning the execution of JavaScript on the back end. And JavaScript today remains the only language that is well supported that can run shared code across client and server isomorphically. And for developers, this is like hearing some amazing solution, which is that you can write code once instead of having to write separate server and client implementations. And that's a very, very big attraction for developers. And this is called universal or isomorphic JavaScript. Now, this is a very, very common model today, and increasingly developer teams are very much moving towards this approach and this paradigm. Also, we know that JavaScript and Java are now the most common languages on GitHub, and that means that you're going to be increasingly finding a lot of folks who want to work with Oracle CX content as a CMS in conjunction with JavaScript-driven presentation layers. And one of the other things that we notice as well is that JavaScript is being adopted very widely in the larger developer market, as well as seen as a very affordable developer profile for teams to resource as well. Now, I want to go to the next feature here, which is the flexibility of headless CMS builds. One of the most important things that headless CMS allow you to do is to expand your ecosystem to a much larger array of possible third-party services that are out there. And oftentimes, a lot of CMS plugins that you find in monolithic ecosystems might not be as flexible as some of the third-party services that developers can build. Now, of course, one of the things I need to mention here that's very crucial is that you have to be very careful here, because these third-party services that you might want to use are primarily governed by developers. But if you want to have those third-party services or integrations fully maintained by your marketer team or your editorial team, those things do need to remain within the kind of OCE milieu. And obviously, we'll have much more information about how our roadmap is progressing in this regard in the future as well. Today, a lot of developers are very focused on the notion of interchangeable services. Just like interchangeable parts revolutionized the industrialization of countries back in the early 20th century, interchangeable services are things that have increasingly become in vogue in the CMS market. And this includes very popular services like Algolia, Typeform, Segment, but also some of the API-enabled services that Oracle offers that allow for this exact kind of plug-and-play developer experience as well. Now, one of the other things that has driven adoption of headless CMS, and one of the reasons why you should consider a headless implementation with Oracle CX content for your next step, is because of the demands on performance that increasingly our customers have for their customer experiences. And this is true not only of websites, but also for all of the digital experiences that you might be considering. And that is the importance of performance, not just in the sense of the delivery of your data directly to your user, but also how the user perceives the delivery of that data. And increasingly today, a lot of companies in the enterprise are focused on the notion of time to first interaction, which is the time between the initial page load and when the user can actually interact with the page. And then, of course, time to first paint, which is when the users actually see something displayed on the page. One of the things that we know is that over the past 5 years, there's been an exponential increase in an exponential decrease in the amount of time that users are willing to wait for a page to load quickly. Back in the day, it used to be 5 seconds. Now it's down to 1. And if your content does not load within 1 second, and your content is not using approaches like lazy loading or link prefetching or some of the techniques that are very common in headless CMS implementations, then you're going to be suffering from a very, very high bounce rate because of the fact that your customers are increasingly demanding that very, very quick response time. Some of the considerations that you should be looking at when it comes to performance are run the gamut across not only very large-scale scalability considerations, but also very, very small-scale considerations within your developer-driven markup or your code itself, which means things like caching or server-side performance and link handling and asset handling, as well as delivery optimization and caching on the edge. These are all very important considerations, and using a headless CMS architecture with CX content can enable you to really focus on a lot of these metrics and a lot of these levers that are extremely important to making sure that your customers don't bounce from your digital experiences. Also, security is a very, very important concern. It's not just about the interaction. It's not just about the performance of your digital experiences. It's also about the security of your digital experiences. One of the things that you might not know about headless CMSs is that they actually aid your security outcomes. And oftentimes what we've heard from a lot of the traditional CMS ecosystems like Drupal and WordPress is every single week there seems to be a new security vulnerability announced and a new urgent patch that you need to call your developers for help with. Headless architectures actually help you to lock down CMS layers and prevent outside access to certain services. The more you decouple your CMS, the more you spread your attack surface area, and the more difficult it is for attackers and nefarious actors to be able to access your CMS. And the way that you can think about this as well is that, let's say that you're interested in on-prem. If you're interested in on-premise Oracle CX content deployment, one of the things that you can do is to firewall all of your content behind that on-premise kind of barrier and prevent anyone from accessing your content. And what you can do is use a static site generator or a serverless implementation to drive the retrieval of that data, but not to give anyone else privileged access to that data that's locked down in your CMS. So if you're concerned about security, if you've seen more and more hacks come into your CMS, if you're worried about some of the security vulnerabilities that you're seeing emerge more and more frequently in ecosystems like Drupal and WordPress, Oracle CX Content's the right choice for you because you can drive a lot of this decoupled architecture that really spreads out the ability for your nefarious actors to be able to access your CMS and the data contained within. Obviously, we have a lot of different layers of protection. One of the things that I just mentioned was the concept of editorial protection. If you're using, for example, an on-premise implementation of Oracle CX Content, that's certainly something that you can drive with more editorial protection. Now, you can also protect yourself because of the fact that sometimes with a serverless implementation, you can actually shut down your instance and not have to have it be running constantly for somebody to access. And those are all really good security methods that you can leverage as well. For those of you who are concerned about accessibility, if you are really interested in how headless CMSs have looked at accessibility, well, one of the things that's been really problematic about JavaScript and the JavaScript Renaissance is the fact that, unfortunately, accessibility has really not been a major concern for JavaScript ecosystems. And now, thanks to more recent innovations, accessibility is no longer a serious issue for the vast majority of people who are building in JavaScript today, which means that a lot of these things that you were concerned about before around accessibility and also around search engine optimization are now moot. And this is now driving a great deal of shift over to a headless CMS architecture and also towards the adoption of JavaScript as well. One of the primary reasons why people are looking for a headless CMS is for an improved developer experience. And you're probably, if you're a CMO or if you're a marketing executive, you're probably getting a lot of tugs on your ear or a lot of emails from your technical teams who are looking for a better architecture for themselves to work with. But as I mentioned earlier, choosing a headless CMS, and especially choosing a headless CMS like CX Content, is something that you have to be very careful about because you might be shutting off the valves for certain users in addition to enabling a better experience for other users. So a headless CMS choice or headless CMS selection is something you should definitely think about very carefully in the context of all of the different individuals you have working in your CMS. I want to talk very briefly here before shifting back over to Lee a little bit about some of the project patterns that a headless CMS enables and why it is that you want to enable your developers and enrich your developer experiences with some of these new project patterns. Number one is pipeline development. Pipeline development is increasingly popular today. One of the things that you'll find is that thanks to the notion of decoupling your development processes, no longer are your developers blocked on each other. You no longer have to worry about the fact that, well, the front end might not be ready. We have to shut down the entire site and move forward in a way that might block each other. And so that's a very important thing. Pipeline development allows for front end and back end teams to work in parallel as opposed to blocking one another in the context of their implementation workflows. Also, upgrades become much easier. If you're moving from let's say that you're working on a WordPress CMS. Some of you might be on WordPress and you have the need to upgrade to a new WordPress version. Well, oftentimes what happens is that your upgrade is going to shut down the entire website. You're not going to be able to have the ability to have your website constantly running unless you have a static cached version or something of that nature. And what that means is that there's always going to be downtime where if a user happens to hit your website at the time that you're performing that update, they're not going to be able to access your website. With a decoupled architecture or headless architecture, because you're using a separate front-end implementation and separate front-end infrastructure, you can actually have decoupled updates where while you're updating your backend, your front-end implementation never goes offline. And of course, the notion of interchangeable presentation layers. One of the really nice things about the differential pace of innovation in JavaScript as opposed to the pace of innovation in the kind of backend world or CMS world is the fact that as you see fit with a decoupled architecture, you can take out and replace and substitute a lot of these front-end implementations that you might be seeing getting obsolete or that you might be seeing getting a little bit outdated. And of course, interchangeable services. If you're using something like a JavaScript framework that enables very rich developer interactions with third-party integrations, or using a Jamstack framework also, then this kind of a model where you're able to introduce and plug and play some of these developer-built or developer-maintained widgets and components can be made much more easy with these decoupled architectures. And last but not least, I want to mention API convergence. And this is a model that we're increasingly seeing at a lot of the systems integrators and a lot of the larger agencies that work on headless CMS implementations. And that is the notion of being able to decouple not only your regular day-to-day maintenance of your decoupled architecture, but also the notion of being able to decouple the entire implementation and the initial build of that architecture in the first place. Thanks to some of the amazing API specification or dummy API modeling tools out there, like like OpenAPI or API Gateway or Apiary, one of the things that you can do is to actually have a meeting at the very beginning of your implementation process where you agree on the mediator, the API that handles the negotiation between the backend and the front end. What happens in this scenario is that once you've agreed on how the data should be served and how the request should look when it comes to getting that information back to the CMS, you can actually dummy out and create an approximation, a fake version of that API, and allow for the front-end developers to work against that API, test against that API, while the back-end developers are busy building out that API according to that specification. And this accelerates development to an incredible degree. It means that you're no longer having to wait for the backend developers to create or facilitate a really nice API, and you're able to really move forward in a very, very accelerated fashion with your front-end development. Here are some of the developer workflows that we are able to enable with a move to a headless CMS implementation. And these are all, of course, workflows that work with CX content if you're using our developer ecosystem. Obviously, you want to have things like scaffolding for your directory structures. You want to have minimal configuration. You want to have a local development environment, hot code reloading, a lot of things that we can provide for you in the context of our developer ecosystem. With that, I wanted to hand the mic back over to Lee, who is going to share a little bit about some of the amazing features that we have outside of the headless sphere in our Oracle CX content product. And we'll share a little bit about some of the exciting things that we're working on today.
Awesome. Thanks, Preston. So yeah, I wanted to give a quick overview of Oracle Content Experience and some of the things that really enable it to be a foundational tool here when talking about content management, and then obviously extending that into the headless capabilities. Just a quick note, whether we're calling it CX Content or Oracle Content Experience, we are referring to the same platform. We have a lot of use cases across the board. Most of them stem across the customer experience themes, but we do cover use cases across applications, across business applications. So just wanted to quickly mention that. But where Oracle Content Experience fits nicely in here is it's a model for being a universal asset hub across the entire enterprise to manage, govern, and deploy any type of assets to channels. That starts here in the center with, oh, you go back a second. Sorry. But on the left side here, it's all the things that we do for content authors and contributors. So starting with content and collaboration and workflow. So the ability to create content and work on it in the platform as opposed to just being a standalone repository like a lot of other content management systems are. Being able to take that content and augment it using AI and ML for easier discoverability and use. And then on the right-hand side, just seeing how we use Oracle Content Experience to surface this content across different audiences, with tight integrations with business applications like we said, customer experience. But again, we support all kinds of use cases when it comes to content management delivery, whether it's surfacing this content to customers or internal employees, vendors, partners, etc. Content personalization, so matching up the content metadata to attributes of visitors to really drive personalization. And then lastly, Oracle Content Experience's API first architecture, like Preston was mentioning, is very important to be able to configure your content into the proper formats to really deliver it to any channel it needs to go to. So all this really creates a great base foundation to run efficient content management strategies from. And so just really quickly wanted to take a quick dive into some of the features that we've spent time on developing to make sure it really is a universal asset hub for all your content needs. So then with smart content, we talked about this briefly here, but what happens in many organizations and many brands have content in so many different places and it's not properly tagged. So one of the first things that we wanted to tackle here was the automation of tagging and classifying digital assets properly, whether this is documents, images, videos, etc. What this does is it makes the content in your Universal Asset Hub system, makes the reusability and the finding of this content so much easier for everyone in the organization when searching across the repository. And what it does, it also helps negate the problem of having to recreate a lot of this content from scratch. Another great thing that we've done around making content more intelligent and discoverable with this is the ability to smart author. So the feature uses the rich metadata that we're already tagging and classifying on assets like images. And while the author and contributor are actually creating content in the system will use that natural language processing to describe them, matching assets in real time. So if you want to go to the next slide. The next topic is just on enhanced video asset management capabilities. So again, looking at the assets that we have within our content management system and staying on the topic of content, one of the things that we're all starting to see here with so many companies and employees shifting to remote work is really the increased use of video content. So with our Video Plus capabilities in Oracle Content Experience, they really enhance how we're able to manage video content from the platform. We're able to collaborate on the video like any other piece of content, whether we've added simple editing tools to even help you crop and trim videos for proper channel renditions, or even use speech to text capabilities to help create things like closed captions. And once we're done with that video and managing it and editing it, once it's ready for publish, we're able to automatically create all the different bit rates and renditions for the video, being able to get it ready to stream without needing to download or do anything else. Staying on the topic to videos, and in addition to some of these video capabilities, and some of the exciting things that we're doing to really make sure we stay on top of this area is a recent acquisition of Sauce Video really sets up Oracle Content Experience to be in an even more unique position to really help companies take advantage of the premium video content to help support communication efforts, both internally and externally. So what Sauce Video helps us solve here is really the ability to crowdsource video content. We're able to collect and curate footage and collaboratively create, edit, and stream these videos directly from within the platform. And with such an easy to use interface and direct tie into Oracle Content Experience, it allows pretty much everyone on the team to be a premium video content contributor with really nothing more than their smartphone. The ability to rapidly build sites and utilize and surface content from your repositories with ease is another way that we allow companies to really hit the ground running. So Preston touched a bit on this with site building in the overview, but the landscape, some companies are moving away from it or towards it, but Oracle Content Experience provides the ability to really do both. So we have created templates, SDKs, starter kits to really help build production-ready experiences with quite ease. And this allows teams to take content directly from their Universal Asset Hub, surface them on the sites quickly and easily to meet a lot of the demands of these communication expectations today. It's a baked-in feature that's simple enough to use and creates great agility for companies to just hit the ground running as soon as they start using the product. And then lastly here, of course, is the ability to now take everything we've done and extend these assets to any channel headlessly like we've been talking about. So everything that we just kind of covered here, from creating, storing, managing all these digital assets, How to make these assets even more powerful for your company, for your organization, more useful, is the ability to properly surface them across any channel or device in really an efficient manner. So what we're doing is really to make sure that the content authors and the developers who are expanding these digital experiences can collaborate effectively to make sure that the author's content is able to get to these different creative channels and devices in really the proper manner. So we're able to do that with a couple things, whether we're doing static site support, some of the seamless GitHub integration, and some of our headless preview. And this is where I wanted to hand it back off to you, Preston, to really kind of dive a little bit deeper into what we're looking at with Oracle Content Experience and how we're looking to dive into more of the headless capabilities that we can offer.
Sure thing. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, so what I wanted to share briefly here was just a quick account of some of the what's there in CX content today. Obviously, we have an exciting roadmap, a lot of stuff coming down the chute, as Lee just shared. And you'll hear much more about some of the exciting headless CMS capabilities that we're going to be introducing in coming weeks and months. But this is generally the current and kind of general way that you should be using Oracle CX content as a headless CMS, which means for those native experiences that you want to drive site building for, visual building for, we've got, of course, a very, very rich site builder, as Lee mentioned, as well as a very, very nice mobile hub experience as well for you to craft mobile applications as well. But for those experiences that your developers might be clamoring for, things like React, Next.js, Gatsby, Angular, Vue, a lot of IT teams are moving towards these kinds of frameworks. If you're hearing about those, Oracle CX content is perfect for those as well, and we're currently working on a variety of boilerplate implementations that will help developers regardless of where they are in their current landscape, as well as, of course, the non-web experiences that our customers are increasingly looking for. Mobile applications, chatbots, augmented reality interfaces, all of the things that we know are very, very crucial to some of the ways in which content is moving more well beyond the web. So there's obviously our API, by the way, has available endpoints and resources and available integrations for you to pull any kind of data that you can imagine out of the CMS. So any data or any content that you're manipulating or any feature you're manipulating within Oracle CX content today is something that you can also work with in a headless environment, meaning that you can get all of this kind of information out of your CX content CMS through these API mechanisms. And I don't have time to go through each and every single one, but just to share with you one of the most interesting and unique features of Oracle CX content. This is one of the most important differentiators that we have that puts us really head and shoulders above the competition, is the fact that Oracle CX content offers differentiated channel-focused delivery of content, which means that let's say that you have content that you want to go to your digital sign or your mobile app, but you don't want that content to go to your website. One of the issues with headless CMSs in general today is that everyone gets to see everything that you expose, no matter what kind of data it is. Even if you have a kind of need to have some data protected, you're still going to have all of that data exposed because it's one single layer, it's one single API that's driving all of that. One of the nice things about our approach with our headless CMS in CX content, however, is that you can actually define which channels, which publishing channels that content goes to. So you can say, for example, if you have embargoed content that cannot go live on a mobile app but can go live on the website, you can very easily drive that sort of a publication action with this channel-based differentiation of content delivery. One of the other things that I wanted to mention as well is we have a variety of SDKs and tools available for developers to really leverage all of the best and all the latest and greatest that we have in our headless CMS for CX content, which means not only a content SDK, which is leveraged by our developer ecosystem, but also our software development kit for mobile development. If you're building iOS or Android applications and you want to pull content into that, you can certainly use our SDKs for that. And we also, of course, have our starter site generator CLI, our command line interface, that helps developers get started very quickly with a lot of the developer needs that they have. So one of the things that I wanted to share is that we recently made a very big shift in the developer ecosystem for Oracle CX content. Primarily, our focus in the past was around learning materials for developers who want to use headless CX content. But today, we're really focused on moving these developer samples into a state where they can be used for your own immediate development and also can be continuously deployed in a very easy way from the context of your CMS. And so we're currently working on those features. You'll hear much more about it in the coming months. But in the meantime, what we're doing is to improve a lot of our samples to be focused on the technologies that we know you as developers and your developer teams want to work with, whether they're JavaScript frameworks or Jamstack frameworks, cross-platform frameworks, or other technologies altogether. All of our samples are being open sourced at the moment, and they're currently getting open sourced in a very, very patchwork way, but we're going to have really, really great announcements. So I highly encourage you to follow us on all of the channels where you get information about CX content, because we're going to have very exciting new developer ecosystem features introduced over the course of the next few quarters, including React.js-driven samples, as well as all of the other frameworks that we know that our developer teams know and love. So eventually you'll see these show up on GitHub, and we have a very, very large roadmap consisting of all of the different things that we know we want to enable for developers to be able to work with in the context of their developer experience. I want to stop here very, very briefly here with just a quick kind of side note about JavaScript and Jamstack deployment. It's a very different approach to some of the things that you might be used to in the Oracle ecosystem. And I want to be very clear about what I mean exactly when I say universal JavaScript. As you can see here, what's going on is that we have our Oracle CX Content CMS hanging out over here, and it's hosted on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. But we also could have within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure a Node.js server that is responsible for generating a server-side a server-side render of our application, and then also provides that flush out to the browser. And as you can see here, the same application code is being used in both environments. And this is a very, very different model from the approach that you might have seen from previous eras. This universality of JavaScript, or the fact that you can use JavaScript, a single implementation, isomorphically across the back end and the front end, is one of the most impressive innovations to happen in front-end development in a very long time. And if you haven't already heard some of these buzzwords from your developer teams, you will very, very soon. In Jamstack, it works very much the same way, where you have an approach where it actually compiles to static files. Unfortunately, one of the things I do know is I don't believe Oracle Cloud Infrastructure currently supports serverless hosting or serverless infrastructure, but there are ways to kind of customize it so it does. Now, what this does is really improves your performance and, of course, your user experience on the other end, and also allows you to provide a very rich interactive experience on the other side of things. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is in our next outlays of information that we'll have about our roadmap and about our incredible features that we've got working, we're going to have a lot more to tell you about in terms of these aspects of our implementations, which means continuous integration, continuous deployment. If you're having a lot of issues with how you're able to get your marketing teams and your editorial teams to understand what the state of the application is, because of the fact that those are two very decoupled and very separate things, we definitely will have solutions for you, and we definitely want to have a conversation with you as well. With that, I'll go ahead and turn over to questions, and I think we have time for quite a few questions here. So thank you very much.
Yeah, awesome, Preston. Thank you so much for going over that. So it looks like a question here from Jason we can take live. It looks like he said, going headless today with CX content locks contributors into form-based contribution. Are there any plans to address this?
Yes, it's a very good question, Jason. Yeah, we're actually having conversations right now about this internally. Yeah, I mean, if you could actually reach out to us, one of the things that we would love to learn about is how exactly your contributors like to work with Site Builder, and what are some of the things that they'd be willing to part with, or what are the things that they absolutely need to have in the context of a headless CMS architecture.
Awesome. Hopefully that helps, Jason. And then Sunil had asked, what is the role of OCE, or content experience, in the conversational interface?
It's a great question, Sunil. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of two ways that you can use Oracle CX Content as a provider of conversational content. The first is by using Oracle Digital Assistant. And from my understanding, there are ways to get content to be served into ODA that allow for a really rich and nice integration experience for folks who want to use not only Oracle CX Content, but also Oracle Digital Assistant. If you're not interested in using Oracle Digital Assistant because you might be looking at, let's say, much more than the chatbot capabilities that are built into ODA, if you're looking at other kinds of platforms like Dialogflow, or you're looking at Amazon Alexa or Google Home, or you're looking at some of the other kind of tools out there like Wit.ai or some of the other conversational frameworks out there, then you can just use Oracle CX content in a headless fashion, where you're consuming the APIs and getting content out and serving that content out to those frameworks. And those are going to be developer built. So you'll have to basically write the integration code that serves the content out from Oracle CX content and puts it into a nice format for Dialogflow or whatever conversational framework you might be using.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, just shows the flexibility of the product here to be able to go headless and be able to kind of meet all those needs that come up in the industry.
Absolutely, Lee. Yep.
I think that's all the questions, unless anyone else has any last second ones here. So once again, thank you, Preston, for joining us. Thank you, Marcy, for setting this up. And thank you guys all for attending.
Thank you. And please feel free to reach out to me at preston.so@oracle.com. I think that was the end of the broadcast.